This is a quiet sector of a quiet front. We buried Ruith in a new pine coffin, but the shroud was too small and the washed feet stuck out. The stink of his corpse came through the clean pine boards, and some of the bearers wrapped handkerchiefs around their faces. Death was not dignified. We hacked a ragged grave in the unfriendly earth and fired a ragged volley over the grave. You could tell from our listlessness no one much missed him. This is a quiet sector of a quiet front. There is no poison gas and no HE. But when they shelled the other end of the village and the streets were choked with dust, women came screaming out of the crumbling houses, clutched under one arm the naked rump of an infant. I thought, how ugly fear is. This is a quiet sector of a quiet front. Our nerves are steady. We all sleep soundly. In the clean hospital bed, my eyes were so heavy, sleep easily blotted out one ugly picture, a wounded militiaman moaning on a stretcher, now out of danger but still crying for water. This on a quiet front. But when I shook hands to leave, an anarchist worker said, "Tell the workers of England, this was not a war of our own making. We did not seek it. But if ever again the fascists rule Barcelona, it will be as a heap of ruins, with us workers beneath it."
Years ago this weekend, the Spanish Civil War broke out. This program is a commemoration of that war from the viewpoint of the writers, journalists and intellectuals who took part in it. Most of them supported the Republicans in Spain, which was the losing side. The Spanish Civil War was an issue on which thinking men felt compelled to take sides. Since the 30s, it's become associated with a whole generation of young men and women who, whatever their backgrounds, identified with the struggle of the Spanish people. Enough, in some cases, to go out and die for it. Even if they didn't go into combat, many wrote and spoke for Spain. It's been called a poet's war. And this program examines the legacy that the writers inside and outside Spain have bequeathed to us. John Cornford, whose poem opened this program, was a communist. A large percentage of English writers actively fought for the left in Spain. But the left was many things. It was a popular front that stretched from liberals at one end through the Independent Labour Party and the revolutionary communists to the anarchists and Trotskyists at the other. And the left was always, of course, in all its different factions, sympathetic to the Republic and against Franco and the fascists. This Republican sympathy attracted the support of major artists from all over the free world, from America, Ernest Hemingway, from France, Rowe, from Europe, Arthur Koestler, from England, Orwell, Auden and Stephen Spender. The bulk of the writing from the Spanish Civil War is on the side of the Republic, and this program, which is about writers, necessarily reflects that state of affairs. Nevertheless, there was vocal support from thinkers on the other side of the political argument, and we've tried to represent it properly. In the early months of the war, a group of liberal authors published a questionnaire which they circulated amongst their colleagues.
Jack Lindsay, left-wing poet and novelist. I believe fascism to be utterly evil and destructive. I stand with every fibre of my being for the people of Spain against the murderous attack of the feudalist remnants backed by Hitler and Mussolini for their imperialist World War purposes. I believe this is an epic conflict in which ideas like freedom and culture lead out with a new and tremendous urgency and irresistible demand on our loyalty. To be above the battle when such a cause is concerned is to be subhuman.
Evelyn Waugh, conservative, novelist and satirist. If I were a Spaniard, I should be fighting for General Franco. As an Englishman, I'm not in the predicament of choosing between two evils. I'm not a fascist, nor shall I become one unless it were the only alternative to Marxism. It is mischievous to suggest that such a choice is imminent.
Victor Gollings, publisher. Of course I am against Franco and fascism. The writer, poet, or artist who says the whole thing is no concern of his is either a knave or a fool, or more probably both.
Ezra Pound, you are all had. Spain is an emotional luxury for a gang of sap-headed dilettantes.
The poet Stephen Spender wrote several poems directly inspired by his experiences in Spain.
Spain, I think, was the grammatization of the whole anti-fascist conflict. It was something we'd all been waiting for. I mean, we were anti-fascists, but everywhere we saw fascism triumphing and the socialism and democracy being crushed.
Claud Cockburn wrote war reports in the Communist Daily Worker under the pen name Frank Pitcairn.
Between the outbreak of the Spanish War in the summer of '36 and when I came back to London, I remember in November, briefly, '36, already the atmosphere was quite extraordinary among the intellectuals. I mean, the heightening of the political awareness.
American radical journalist I.F. Stone wrote leaders in the New York Post defending the Republic.
The Spanish War was a test of the will of the Western democracies. And the fascist powers were very well aware of it. If they were going to crumple on Spain, as they did with the Non-Intervention Pact, they were going to be pushovers.
The issues of the Spanish conflict seemed clear enough to a generation disturbed by the rise of fascism or by the threat of communism. The Civil War was the cue which released political sympathies. The right saw it as a Christian crusade against the destruction of church and monarchy. Liberals sprang to defend an elected democracy threatened by a military rebellion. For the left, Spain was the ground on which to stop the advances of Hitler and Mussolini. And revolutionary communists saw in the Spanish Republic a workers' state, putting the principles of revolution into action. They were all agreed that what was happening in Spain in 1936 was a rehearsal of the conflict that was shortly to happen all over the rest of Europe. Republican posters showed the fascist claw grasping the Spanish peninsula, and in the words of poets like George Barker, the map of Spain became the stage on which their hopes and ideals were played out.
Star-crossed on its own limbs, I saw Spain like a rose spread eagle to a knife. The mountain muscles and the Gibraltar jaw, the French forehead and the fist of grief, seized by a sadist for a Caesar's leaf big on the head. Browbeaten, I saw the face of Spain struck to a badge of war for a king's coat, but to a heart's grief. O hero akimbo on the mountains of tomorrow, star-crossed, spread-eagled and brow-beaten Spain, I see your starved shape grow more strong from pain, leap finer and freer from the grave of sorrow. I see you go gallivanting on the hills again, O hero akimbo on the mountains of tomorrow.
When war broke out on July 18th with a royalist rebellion in Spanish Morocco, Spain was one of Europe's youngest republics. 5 years before it had been a right-wing dictatorship, and 5 years before that a feudal kingdom. In 1931, a moderate Republican coalition came to power promising land reform, but centuries of feudalism made reform slow and difficult. And Spain in the 1930s was made up of very different political traditions. The Civil War started in Morocco, where the army supported the monarchist party, the Carlists. It also broke out in the west of Spain, the home of the Falangist or Fascist party centered on Burgos. The rest of Spain supported the Republic, but for very different reasons. Barcelona was dominated by anarchists and Trotskyists, while in the north, near Bilbao, were the fiercely independent Basques and the revolutionary miners of Asturias. In 1934, wishing to push reform faster, the Asturian miners rebelled against the government. Their uprising was crushed with great savagery. For the next 2 years, a right-wing government held back reform. But with the elections of February 1936, hopes rose again. The Spanish workers were determined to prevent a repetition of 1934. They armed themselves to fight not the government, but a rebellion of Franco's Moorish troops who invaded the Spanish mainland. Barricades appeared in the streets, but against Franco's army they needed more than idealism and sandbags. The communist leader, La Pasionaria, appealed to the world for aid.
Anti-fascist workers, working people, arise. Prepare for the defense of the Republic and of liberty and the people's democratic achievements with the slogan, No pasarán! The fascists shall not pass.
The fascists were already passing, in huge numbers from Germany and Italy to Spain. To prevent an escalation of the war, France and England set up a non-intervention committee. It had the support both of the Tory government and the official Labour Party. Its actions were defended by the Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden.
And I'm sure that this policy of non-intervention is the only one which the government of this country should, at this moment, pursue. And that it has the support of the great mass of people who, deeply as they deplore, and they do deplore, the causes of this strife in Spain, believe it to be the first duty of their government to limit that strife to the great and unhappy country where it now takes place.
I rise to intervene in this debate with apologies. And
The most vocal opposition came from the Communist parties and the ILP under James Maxton.
I am as anxious to prevent a wholesale conflagration as anybody. I am as pacifist as anyone, but I do not propose to walk on eggs and keep my mouth shut because of that. Even supposing that the ultimate consequence of expressing my point of view means that I'm going to be smashed to bits. I'm not going to tremble all the time because there are one or two bullies in Europe. Honourable members say we would rather have Spanish fascism than Russian communism.
Yeah.
That gets a loud response at once. Russia is a long way away, and Spain is very close, and closer still to our allies. But this is a problem for the government. It may sit back today with arms folded and say, it is nothing to us who rules in Spain. We have a detached and independent position. We regret it, and we wring our hands like Pilate. Take it from me that if there had been a revolt of the German people against the power of Hitler in Germany, all my sympathy and support would have been given to the rebels. Similarly, I see quite honestly that on this occasion, all my sympathies and support, for what they're worth, are with the Spanish government.
With most of the Spanish army on Franco's side, and the British and French governments refusing to intervene, it was left to the trades unions, the independent socialists, the communists and Soviet Russia to support the Republic. The formation of international brigades to fight in Spain made many lifelong pacifists change their beliefs, like the secretary of the Independent Labour Party, Lord Brockway.
The Spanish Civil War was absolutely decisive in my thinking in two directions. First, I ceased to be an absolute pacifist. I wanted the workers in Barcelona and the Democrats throughout Spain to win. And I came to the conclusion, if I wanted them to win, I must help them to win.
ILP chairman Bob Edwards took his support one stage further.
People like me, the independent Labour parties that have always been anti-war and pacifists, came to the conclusion we had to try and halt it in Spain. And that led us to the belief that it wasn't enough to send ambulances and medical supplies and pass resolutions. We had to send some fighting men. And so we organised an ILP contingent to fight in the international militia on the Aragon front, and I was privileged to be elected the captain, the leader, commander of the ILP contingent, which became part of an international militia of about 800 men altogether.
The brigades, they were a symbol of the fact that it was a world, part of a world struggle, and of course a testimony of solidarity with the Spanish people, but an educating influence in the sense of making people realize there was a war coming against fascism. This was the opening episode.
But the Spanish and international workers who made up the bulk of the brigades had little training, as political journalist Lawrence Fernsworth observed.
You saw them marching in Barcelona, for instance, where I was stationed at the beginning, but I wouldn't actually call it training. They were sent out to the fronts and various places, and that's where the training got underway.
The ramshackle training of the brigades wasn't just apparent to the Republican side. It could be seen by nationalists as well, like right-wing volunteer and writer Peter Kemp, one of the half-dozen or so Englishmen to volunteer for Franco's side.
I think they suffered from a lack of good junior officers and NCOs. They also suffered from very bad staff work, but our own staff work wasn't all that good, but it was a great deal better than the Republicans. You see, most of the regular army that could do so came over to our side. I think you'll find that in Madariaga's book on Spain. And as a result, the other side didn't really have much Spanish expertise.
Almost all the officer corps had deserted to the rebels, to Franco. And we had command of our lot. It was a man who had been a young man, he'd been a colonel in the Spanish Foreign Legion. And he was splendid. He looked like something straight out of Beaugest, you know, marvelous sort of cape, scarlet cloak and all this. And we reverenced him because he was a military man, understood all. And so, on one day, one evening, he announced we were going to make a secret night attack on the enemy positions. Well, it never seemed to me a very profitable idea, however, they were everywhere. And so we said, oh, what we didn't know was that our commander had absconded just before the attack and had gone round by devious paths and joined the enemy. And in order to prove his credentials, so to speak, he said, well, just a minute, I've ordered for attack, so just get everything ready and mow them down. So he, no doubt, got high promotion in the Franco army.
When it came to set battles with tanks, the weapons were all on the other side. You couldn't do much about it. A group of international men, 600 of them, fighting. The first day they were there, 3/4 of them died in one battle because they hadn't the weapons. They were trying to stop tanks with handmade grenades, which were more dangerous to them when they threw them than the tanks they threw them at. You know, you have to throw this hand grenade and duck quick, unless it exploded on you.
The young Marxist student, John Cornford, was in France when the war broke out. He enlisted almost immediately in Aragon. The cause of the Spanish workers embodied everything he stood for, a struggle between oppressors and oppressed, as he communicated in letters to his friend, Margot Heinemann.
Darling, I'll explain in a minute, but just at the moment I'm spending whole days at the front with nothing to do, so I'm writing you an immense letter. If it wasn't so hot here, I'd try to get my ideas and impressions sorted out, but I can't, so I'm writing everything down as it comes out. First of all, a last will and testament. As you know, there is a risk of being killed. Statistically not very great, but it exists all the same. First of all, why am I here? You know the political reasons. There is a subjective reason as well. From the age of 17, I was, in a kind of way, tied down and envied my contemporaries a good deal of their freedom to bum about. And it was partly because I felt myself, for the first time, independent, that I came out here. but I promise this is the last time I shall leave you unnecessarily. Maybe that the party will send me, but after this I will always be with you when I have a chance.
Aragon was totally dedicated to the Republican cause, but Coldford observed divisions in the trenches nevertheless. In an essay on the situation in Catalonia, he criticised the Trotskyists, who wanted total revolution immediately and were demanding arms for the workers that were desperately needed in the trenches. No such divisions occurred among the nationalists, and there were few volunteers. With 70,000 Moors, Franco had no need of them. But 6 Englishmen did volunteer for Franco, compared with the 2,000 who volunteered for the Republican International Brigades, and Peter Kemp wrote about his experiences of enlistment.
I was given the choice of, as a foreigner, I naturally couldn't join the regular Spanish army. I was given the choice of the Spanish Foreign Legion, but strongly advised not to, because although it is called Foreign Legion, it's 90% Spaniards, and I had no Spanish at all when I went out there. And I was told, not speaking the language, I should be in an awful mess if I did join the ranks. And the alternatives then were the Carlist militia, or Requetés, or the Falange, who were roughly equivalent to the fascists. Obviously, the Falange were anathema to me. And the Requetés were very much, as I thought in those days, stood for the sort of thing that I had stood for at Cambridge. And as a result, I was given by these officers on the general staff, I was given introductions to the Carlist leaders in Toledo. At that time, the attack on Madrid was just developing, and Toledo was the advanced headquarters of the nationalist armies. And so I went south, and there I met the Carlist leaders, and within a few days I found myself a trooper in a cavalry squadron, irregular cavalry, very irregular cavalry, of Andalus peasants.
The Spanish cavalry had a romantic appeal for the monarchists of the right, but more important in raising support for the nationalists was the power of Catholicism, particularly in Catholic countries like France and Ireland. Ewan O'Duffy wrote about raising a nationalist battalion in Crusade in Spain.
Interest in the Irish Brigade was now growing fast. 17 counties were represented in this party, the largest contingent coming from Tipperary. Referring to their departure, the Right Reverend Monsignor Ryan, Dean of the Archdiocese of Cashel, preaching Mass on the following Sunday, said,
"They have gone to fight the battle of Christianity against communism, and there are hosts of difficulties facing the men whom General O'Duffy is leading, and only heroes can fight such a battle. And those at home can help the cause with their prayers. The rosary is more powerful than weapons of war. In the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ, let us promise that we will offer 1 decade of the family rosary daily for poor, suffering Spain, for the Irish boys who've gone out to fight the desperate battle that's threatening desolation all over the world. Let us pray that the destruction of civilization may be averted, and that Christ may live and reign, and that communism and the power of Satan on earth may be brought to naught."
The church was always above ground, always militant. From the very beginning, they fought every move. They fought every move of the Republic. They fought the secularization of schools. They fought the secularization of cemeteries. They fought the law of divorce, everything. They took the position and issued proclamations liberalism is a saying no Catholic can be a liberal. Oh yes, they were tooth and nail from the very beginning.
There were some young men who responded to the romantic appeal of traditional Spain and felt that the generation of Auden and Spender had no understanding of the Spanish people and regarded their Republican sympathies as posturing. A South African poet, Roy Campbell, was attracted to nationalism not just because of what it stood for, but also because of everything on the left that it was against.
Against the bogus prophets of the day, chained to corruption, failure and decay, what can I do but take the trampled sand? Destor, by the rightness of my hand, whose opening palm of victory the sign, branched from the mesa with the bread and wine. By the same toil engendered as the grain, many million more the might of Spain. As doomed anachronisms, sire and son, capitalist and communist make one, the scrawny offspring and the bloated sire, sentenced by nature to the same hot fire. So in red Bloomsbury the two are tied, like gangsters to be taken for a ride. From every communist you can unsheath the snug fat bourgeois creeping underneath. And every Babbitt is a fox's hole from which a scrawny comrade snarls for dole. So in red Spain they're fighting side by side, by common desperation both allied, both indispensable and no more strange than the unhealthy hide is to the mange. Since my existence has been lived and fought, as theirs at Oxford ready-made was bought, and in my teens I shed like threadbare trousers every experience possible to wowsers. I know what rings their withers night and morn, to wish, quite rightly, they had not been born.
I never felt that I was really proletarian, and or that I'd really joined the workers. I felt frightened of the workers, really, and I didn't. I think there was a slightly later generation of Cornford and Julian Bell, and particularly a young writer called Christopher Caldwell, a very, very fine critic indeed. All three of these were killed in Spain, who really did try to go over to the workers. I mean, they gave up their middle-class standard of living. They lived in sort of working-class districts, I suppose, and they really participated in the life of the workers. I never really did this. I remained very much the kind of person who I still am.
Although many of the volunteers were communists, there were also many social democrats opposed to the extremes of left or right.
Many of these young people who came to Spain from America were really concerned young people. They were dedicated young people. I saw them there in Spain. They did not come as go there as communists. They did not go there as members of the Lincoln Brigade. It was only after they got there that they were shunted into the brigade and under communist control.
It's one of the greatest tragedies of the Spanish Civil War, to my mind, that people whom I knew and liked and respected went out to fight for precisely the same reasons as I went to fight on the nationalist side. They went to fight on the Republican side. And some of them were killed, and two of them within a few hundred yards of me, although, of course, at the time I didn't know they were there. That was in the Battle of the Jarama. It's one of the saddest things about the Spanish Civil War. And I think if you remember Arthur Koestler, who wrote a piece in The God That Failed, a book that came out just after the war, I think he comments on the cynicism of the communists in exploiting the honorable emotions and generous emotions of young people.
I thought it was wrong that the propaganda of the for the International Brigade should pretend that the International Brigade was a sort of liberal Republican organization which is entirely sort of democratic in its structure and its ideas and so on. Of course, it wasn't. It was run entirely by the communists, and there were personal tragedies. For instance, I think I describe in the autobiography I wrote, World Within World, how at the front I met a young man, aged about 18, an English schoolboy who'd come out to Spain, and as a liberal, certainly not as a communist at all, he hated the communists, but he'd been told it was a sort of liberal cause. And he said to me, look, you see, I have to walk to the brow of this hill every day of my life until I'll get killed. And 6 weeks later, he was killed. And I thought this was, in fact, I wrote an article called Heroes in Spain, which was published in the New Statesman, attacking the brigade about this, saying this kind of propaganda shouldn't be used if they should say what the International Brigade really stood for.
Heart of the heartless world, dear heart, the thought of you is the pain at my side, the shadow that chills my view. The wind rises in the evening, reminds that autumn is near. I am afraid to lose you. I am afraid of my fear. On the last mile to Huesca, the last fence for our pride, think so kindly, dear, that I sense you at my side. And if bad luck should lay my strength into the shallow grave, remember all the good you can. Don't forget my love.
On December the 27th, John Cornford was killed in action. It was his 21st birthday.
Viva España! Viva España! Viva España!
From the very beginning, the Civil War was fought under intense public scrutiny. Because Germany and Italy were so involved, and England and France remained officially neutral, propaganda was crucially important.
There were very new things about this war. It was the first war which was conducted, in which propaganda for both sides and news for both sides was conducted on radio, for instance. This was something absolutely new. You see, the First World War was conducted entirely, through official propaganda on each side, and outside the country which you happened to be in, you didn't really know what the other side was saying except through the press. But here we'd hear, these people shouting at each other across the radio.
Any damage I could do them, I would do. Certainly. I know bones about that at all. In the same way, after all, if you're prepared to shoot people with a gun, well then, as in my case, typewriter is somewhat more mighty than the rifle. Of course, I used the typewriter to the same purpose.
Including inventing a battle.
We invented an entire battle, yes. There was a huge consignment of arms, which it was going to be possible to rush across the Spanish frontier from France, and which could decide the fate of the first battle of Teruel. Which was crucial. And the government, the Blum government, the socialist government, was terrified of turning a blind eye or discovering that it had. So, I arrived in Paris, and Otto said to me, now look, tomorrow afternoon, the communists and the extreme left socialists are going to go to Blum, asking him to instruct the frontier guards to let these trains of guns through, you see. Very large quantity, big guns and so on. And but Rowe is very nervous. But if he was suddenly to feel that there's a chance that Franco might actually lose, and if this were to, just before they arrived, this would might turn the scale. So I said, well, how do we do that? I mean, how do we impress Bloom with the idea that Franco might lose? So we thought and thought, and Otto came up with the idea that if there were a revolt against Franco in Tetuan, Morocco, where he started from, that this would be tremendously impressive, very sensational, with headlines, very paper. So we sat down to manufacture this revolt in Tetuan, and it was very difficult. We only had a Baedeker, and it had no contours, you see, so you couldn't tell.
The mosque in the marketplace.
Well, it was the mosque in the marketplace, all right, but supposing there was a hill, you see, and we had people firing at one another from certain points, and there was a huge hill in between, you see, so we had to be very careful of that.
Yes, I think there was always quite a lot of pressure on me, some of it sort of self-applied, to try to write propaganda. I mean, I think that one felt that one felt the propaganda wasn't necessarily bad. I mean, one felt that if one cared sufficiently, for instance, about anti-fascism, that one ought to be able to write an anti-fascist poem, and that this anti-fascist poem ought to be able to influence people. And so I think to some extent one tried to do this.
Some of the English support for the Republic, like the writings and speeches of Charlotte Haldane, was reminiscent of the propaganda of the First World War.
My 2 men are in Spain. My husband helping with the gas defense measures, and my 17-year-old son fighting with the International Brigade. It's not been pleasant, lying in bed, recovering from pleurisy, wondering about them. But the only antidote to that sort of thing is to think up ways and means of helping anti-fascism to a smashing victory from this end.
In the first year of the war, the bulk of propaganda on both sides centered on atrocities. On April the 26th, 1937, German planes bombed the civilian population of the Basque capital city, Guernica. But if Guernica moved Picasso to his most powerful expression of grief, it moved the world's press to an orgy of mutual recrimination. No sooner had the story of a German attack on Guernica broken than the right-wing press carried stories that the raid was limited to a few strategic targets and the city had been destroyed by other forces.
The story was, and I do believe this, that before retreating, the Asturian miners, the dinamiteros, had set fire to and blown up large parts of the town, as they did in Irun and in San Sebastian, except they were chased out of there too quick, as they did in other Basque cities like Eibar and Orvieta. I can't think of any others, but one went through these towns and you saw the carbon deposit on the walls, the petrol being thrown over them. I also talked to Harold Cardoso, the Daily Mail, and a Frenchman called Morton, who were the first journalists into Guernica and who talked to the people. And they assured me that the people there told them that it was the Asturians who'd blown the place up.
But carbon deposits are also left by incendiary bombs, and ex-members of the German Condor Legion have testified to dropping incendiaries on many Spanish towns, including Guernica. And the press carried stories and denials of stories even more outrageous.
The right propaganda in the right across the board of the papers, was something which would be impermissible today. I mean, people would laugh it out of court, not merely as being right, but I mean as being sort of obvious lies. In all the business about raping nuns and burning convents and all this kind of thing, you know, was pouring out through the whole press.
I went to a convent in Barcelona where it was alleged that nuns had been raped. It had been taken over by the workers. It had been converted into a printing press for their paper. The nuns had all departed to France, and they showed me a letter from the Mother Superior expressing appreciation, while very strongly disagreeing with them, of the way in which they had allowed the nuns to depart. I was a little bit suspicious of this letter, but I got John McNair afterwards, when he had left Spain to communicate with the Mother Superior, and she confirmed it. So it wasn't all atrocity.
But a great deal rested on proving that this was a just war. La Pasionaria speeches were reported around the world, and the nationalists listened to the nightly broadcasts of the colourful General Quiepo de Llano. But not all the nationalist propaganda corps met with the same success.
The people who were given the job of conducting officers to escort journalists around were mostly dug-out old cavalry officers from the Moroccan wars who would ask the journalists if they played polo or where they shot, and regarded them anyway as at best a nuisance and at worst probably spies. Franco's propaganda, as far as this country was concerned, was so appalling, and the other side was so brilliant, that it's not entirely surprising that we got a very bad press.
The nationalists published 3 reports claiming to reveal Republican atrocities. At the back of the French edition of Arthur Koestler's Spanish Testament, there appeared similar photographs of fascist outrages. The English press incorporated many such photos into their reports.
Well, I mean, I think that all reporting is a form of propaganda. There's no such thing as a neutral reporter. There is no business to exist. I mean, it's a vegetable. A man who doesn't know the difference between right and wrong. It's absurd. And of course he does. And the idea, sort of heresy of the facts, and the idea that you just pick up things like stones on a beach, put them together, and that's the truth. Of course it isn't. And there is any good reporter, just because he's gotten to be a good reporter, presumably has passions, beliefs, and some understanding of the situation, in which case he's also, ipso facto, a propagandist.
Writers in Spain were compelled to find some pattern in the carnage. But when Ernest Hemingway, who was a Republican sympathizer, chronicled a brutal series of murders, they were once committed by his own side in the town of Ronda, where 512 nationalists were slaughtered. He described the scene in For Whom the Bell Tolls.
Did you see the start of the movement in any small town?
No.
Then you've seen nothing. Listen. After the assault was successful, and the last 4 guards had surrendered, and my husband, Pablo, had shot them against the wall, we drank coffee at the cafe that always opens earliest in the morning. He proceeded to the organization of the plaza. The carts were piled exactly as for an amateur bullfight, except that the side towards the river was not enclosed, that was left open. Then Pablo ordered the priest to confess the fascists and give them the necessary sacraments. While the priest was engaged in these duties, Pablo organized those in the plaza into 2 lines. They were armed with flails, such as are used to beat out the grain, and they were a good flail's length apart. Those that had not got flails had heavy herdsmen's clubs or ox goads, and some had wooden pitchforks, those with wooden tines that are used to fork the chaff and straw into the air after the flaying. Some had reaping hooks and sickles, but those Pablo placed at the far end of the lines where they reached down to the edge of the cliff. Most of the men in the lines were quiet, and I heard one say, "Will there be women?" And another one said, "I hope to Christ, no." And I heard a shout, and someone said, "Here comes the first one." And it was Don Benito Garcia, the mayor, and he came out bareheaded, walking slowly from the door and down the porch. Nothing happened. Then he was walking between the lines of men, his head up, his fat face grey, his eyes looking straight ahead and then flickering from side to side, walking steadily, and nothing happened. From a balcony, someone shouted, "What's happening, cowards?" And still Don Benito walked between the men. Nothing happened. And I saw a man, 3 men down from where I was standing. His face was working, he was biting his lips, and his hands were white on his flail. And I saw him looking towards Don Benito, watching him come on. And still, nothing happened. And just before Don Benito came abreast of this man, the man raised his flail high in the air so it struck the man beside him, and he smashed a blow at Don Benito that hit him on the side of his head. And Don Benito looked at the man, and the man struck again and shouted, "That for you, cabron!" The blow hit him in the face, and he put his hands to his face, and they beat him till he fell. And the man who'd struck first called to the others to help him. He took hold of the collar of Don Benito's shirt, and the others took hold of him by the arms. And with his face in the dust of the plaza, they dragged him across the walk. After Don Benito, no one would come out. There was no noise now in the plaza. Everyone was waiting to see who would come out. Then a drunkard in a great voice shouted, "Let the bull come out!" Let us all go together. Don Ricardo Montalvo, who was a landowner, said to Pablo, raising his head and stopping, praying to speak. "One at a time, as you're ready," said Pablo. "Then I go now," said Don Ricardo. He came out of the front of the Ayuntamiento, his grey hair and his little grey eyes, and his thick neck, looking very short and angry, and he looked at the double row of peasants, and he spat on the ground. He could spit actual saliva, and in such a circumstance, as you should know, English, that is very rare. And he said, "Arriba España, down with the miscalled Republic, and I piss in the milk of your fathers." And they clubbed him to death very quickly after that because of the insult, beating him as he reached the first of the men, beating him as he tried to walk with his head up, and beating him until he fell, and chopping at him with the sickles and reaping hooks. Many men bore him to the edge of the cliff to throw him over, and there was blood now on their hands and on their clothing. And now began the feeling that these men who came out were truly enemies.
and should be killed.
The excesses of propaganda and reporting sometimes concealed the fact that there were many genuine terrible atrocities as the nationalist army proceeded through Spain. The terror campaign against Republicans in Malaga, reported by Arthur Koestler, the bombing of refugees in the south of Spain, and the savage murder of 4,000 civilians in Badajoz all helped to secure nationalist victories. And while the West remained neutral, victories were being secured. When Toledo, Badajoz and Malaga fell, it meant that the army in the south and the army in the west could thrust together on Madrid. Nationalist victories and fascist military aid were a serious threat to a Republican army held together more by ideology than hardware. Spain had always nurtured political extremes. The Trotskyist party, POUM, was particularly strong in the east. They believed that extending the revolution to the whole of Spain was as important as winning the war, and the revolutionary atmosphere was certainly impressive.
You certainly felt that this city really was owned by the people. I mean, everyone seemed to sort of walk with a different kind of step and so on. It was like, you know, Wordsworth, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. His wonderful description of the French Revolution in the prelude. One had that kind of feeling.
Most powerful of all were the anarchists. At the beginning of the war in Catalonia, they vastly outnumbered the communists, particularly in the trade unions.
Spain, I believe, is the only country, where anarchism seriously took root. This was due to two reasons. One is the intense individualism of the Spaniard, and the other reason is the, what you might call the mystical or spiritual quality of the Spaniard, because a great deal of mysticism is a dedicated anarchist is a mystic. He treats anarchy as a religion.
The anarchist code was neatly characterized by Hemingway later in For Whom the Bell Tolls. A Republican guerrilla is on his way with a message to prevent a doomed attack by a Republican column and has to cross the anarchist lines.
How many are you?
Don't shoot, comrades, don't shoot. I want to come in.
How many are you?
One. Me, alone.
Who are you?
Andres Lopez Ovillo Conejos. From Pablo's band. With a message.
Do you have rifle and equipment?
Yes.
We can let no one in without a rifle, and no group larger than 3.
I'm alone. It's important, let me come in.
How many are you?
One. Me alone, for the love of God.
He talks like a Christian. Throw a bomb at him.
No, that would be a mistake. This is important, let me come in.
You are alone.
How many times do I have to tell you I'm alone?
Then if you're alone, stand up and hold your rifle over your head. Now come through the wire. We've got you covered with a machine gun.
I need my hands to get through the wire.
It would have been simpler to throw a bomb at him.
Tell him to sling his rifle. He can't possibly come through here with his hands above his head. Use your sense.
All those fascists are the same, one condition after another.
I'm not a fascist. I'm a guerrillero from Pablo's band.
I've never heard of Pablo's band. Sling your rifle through the wire and use your hands to come through.
Before we loose the machine gun at you.
Brothers, I'm not important.
I believe it.
I'm not important, but my business is serious.
There's nothing more serious than liberty. Do you think there's anything more serious than liberty?
No. Viva la libertad!
Viva la FAI! Viva la CNT! Long live anarcho-syndicalism and liberty!
Long live us!
He's a comrade, and I might have killed him.
The visionary anarchists were only one problem in the Republic. The government was depending more and more on Russia for arms and supplies. When the nationalists and their allies blockaded the ports, the Russians helped to organize the provision of food to the starving population of cities like Bilbao. Russia also sent commissars to train the brigades. Hemingway noted their growing influence. Later, it behooved the Baltos, the guerrilla fighter, held up by the anarchists from delivering his vital message, is arrested inside the communist lines by one of these commissars, the Moscow-trained André Marty.
I must take you to the crazy. Besides, he has your dispatch.
Can't you tell someone?
Yes, I'll tell the first responsible man I see. Everyone knows he's crazy. He has a mania for shooting people.
Shooting them?
Yes, he kills more than the plague. But he doesn't kill fascists like we do. He kills rare things. Trotskyists, deviationists, any kind of rare beast. We always provide the firing squad. The brigades wouldn't shoot their own men. We shot French, Belgians. Always for political things.
Where are the prisoners?
Have a drink.
Why not?
Stand.
Over there.
Listen, Comrade Marty. Once tonight we've been impeded by the ignorance of the anarchists, then by the sloth of a bureaucratic fascist, now by your communist over suspicion.
Close your mouth, this isn't a meeting.
Comrade Marty, this is a matter of the utmost urgency, of the greatest importance.
Everything is of urgency, all things are important. How did you know General Goltz was here? You understand how serious it is to come asking for an individual general before a battle? How would you know such a general was here?
Tell him.
Comrade Marty, I was given that dispatch on the other side of the lines.
The other side of the lines? Yes, I heard you came from the fascist lines.
It was given to me by an Inglese named Roberto, who'd come to us as a dynamiter. You understand?
Go on, continue your story.
Well, Comrade Marty, he told me to bring it to General Goltz with all speed. He makes an attack in these hills now, on this day. And all we ask is to take it to him now, promptly.
Take them away.
Comrade Marty, do not be insane.
Listen to me, a loyal officer and a comrade. That is a dispatch that must be delivered. This comrade brought it through the fascist lines to give to Comrade Goltz.
Take them away.
I mean, he's not going to send them
Don't
stuff?
you see?
He's mad.
Yes, he's crazy. You're crazy, hear? Crazy. Hear me, you crazy murderer?
Take them away.
I said earlier how the Spanish Civil War destroyed my absolute pacifism. It also had a decisive influence in my thinking in making me opposed to communist totalitarianism, as reflected in Stalin. And in the later days of the struggle in Spain, the ILP and those who held our views were crushed between these two forces, the Franco-fascist forces on the one side and the Stalinist forces on the other.
In the early months of 1936, there had been a full-scale social revolution in Spain. Support for the Republic was based on a belief that everything was going to change, and Prime Minister Largo Caballero was respected by socialists and revolutionaries alike. Anti-Catholic fervour and the belief in workers' control held the coalition together. But Russia wanted a popular front against fascism and needed to play down the revolution in order to attract support abroad for the anti-fascist cause. As the war drew on, Russian control of strategy tightened.
The reason why the communist influence grew was because of the Non-Intervention Pact. I mean, the fascist powers were allowed to strangle the Republic while we shut off arms. The only place to get arms was from the Russians, and the Russians exacted a price. And in the terrible heat of the struggle, the real issue was the survival of the Republic. And the communist problem could be handled later.
No one saw the gradual change in Spain more clearly than George Orwell. He'd arrived in Barcelona as a journalist, but his libertarian sympathies made him enlist as a fighter.
He wanted to leave us and go and fight in Madrid. Everybody wanted to go to Madrid. That's where the action was, see. And I'm afraid I insulted him. I called him a bloody scribbler. I said, you bloody scribbler, you don't know what this war is all about. You've no experience in the working class movement. This is a social revolution. It's not just an ordinary war. And I thought, well, at the end of the month he can go where he wants. But I have sometimes tried to convince him. And then the trouble blew up in Barcelona. The workers went on strike against the seizure of power there from a democratically elected government of Catalonia, and that brought him back to his old libertarian approach.
When I first reached Barcelona, I had thought it a town where class distinction and great differences of wealth hardly existed. Certainly that was what it looked like. Smart clothes were an abnormality. Nobody cringed or took tips. Waiters and flower women and bootblacks looked you in the eye, called you comrade. In the first month of the revolution, there must have been many thousands of people who deliberately put on overalls and shouted revolutionary slogans as a way of saving their skins. Now things were returning to normal. The smart restaurants and hotels were full of rich people wolfing expensive meals, while for the working class population, food prices had jumped enormously without any corresponding rise in wages. The restaurants and hotels seemed to have little difficulty in getting whatever they wanted. But in the working class quarters, the queues for bread, olive oil, and other necessities were hundreds of yards long. The workers' patrols had been ordered to dissolve, and the pre-war police forces were back on the streets.
I could see the change when they halted the revolution, put the officers in uniform with gold brace, started saluting, getting rid of the inequality of pay, halting the social advance. People lost heart, moving the people from the country into the towns, creating wide areas where an army could maneuver without any hostility. And so I couldn't see we could win the war under those conditions. I thought the Spanish affair was essentially a social revolution. It could only be won if the social revolution continued. We started to lose where it was stopped.
In the spring of 1937, the war was at a stalemate. The nationalists had failed to capture Madrid and had been held back in Aragon. But the blockade on Bilbao, with its effect on arms and supplies, made the need for republican respectability even greater. The communists halted the revolution and took away the workers' armaments. In Barcelona, the result was a week of riots between the parties of the left.
The communists had taken over the government. They had sacked Caballero, who was the social democratic Prime Minister. They were denouncing the CNT, the main trade union movement in Barcelona, and PUM, who had carried out the social revolution there, as enemies, social fascists, and I don't know what not. And they were being driven back on Barcelona. And I was becoming very concerned about the fate of our boys there. I went to the communist official who was in charge of giving permits for people to leave. I was glad to find he was only too happy for the ILP contingent to leave, so I got them out. But they had already arrested young Bob Smiley. At the frontier, they charged him with having fascist notes in his diary and of carrying a bomb. As a matter of fact, the notes were only notes about what was happening in Barcelona. They weren't fascist at all. And the bomb was a dud and was a souvenir which he was going to bring to England. Oh, a small bomb. They arrested him.
This is the Stalinists who arrested him?
The Stalinists arrested him and imprisoned him in Valencia. And he died in prison. They said that he died from appendicitis, I think they claimed. Whether he died from physical assault or from illness, I don't know. But even if it was the latter, when I went to Valencia and made investigations, I'm quite sure there was great medical negligence and that he need not have died. He was a great boy. He was the chairman of our ILP Guild of Youth.
Like Bob Smiley, Orwell was an ILP member, and so in the Barcelona fighting, a suspected Trotsky fascist. Forced to go into hiding, his bitterness rose against the communists.
There is already the beginning of a dangerous split in the world working class movement. A few more libels against lifelong socialists, a few more frame-ups like the charges against the PUM, and the split may become irreconcilable. The question has got to be settled. To make the wrong decision may be to land ourselves in for centuries of semi-slavery. But so long as no argument is produced, except a scream of Trotsky fascist, the discussion cannot even begin. It would be impossible for me, for instance, to debate the rights and wrongs of the Barcelona fighting with a Communist Party member, because no communist, that is to say no good communist, could admit that I have given a truthful account of the facts. In such circumstances, there can be no argument. The necessary minimum of agreement cannot be reached. What purpose is served by saying men like Maxton are in fascist pay? Only the purpose of making serious argument impossible. It is as though in the middle of a chess tournament, one competitor should suddenly begin screaming that the other is guilty of arson or bigamy. The point that is really at issue remains untouched. Libel settles nothing.
Supposing you accept some kind of argument that you must deny in the intellectual freedom of the opposition in order that you may achieve a kind of society in which for the time being there's no intellectual freedom, but at the end of the line there'll be unprecedented intellectual freedom. Well, this kind of argument, if you support this kind of argument, it means that you may have brought about a kind of society concerning which you will be disillusioned, and then you will find that you have silenced yourself, and you're no longer able to say, well, you're not able to say this is not the kind of society that I wanted or cared about. So that my deepest sympathies were always with George Orwell and André Gide and people like this, and still are.
Everything that Orwell says is true, But events were moving very, very rapidly to a tragic conclusion. I remember when friends of mine who were partisans of the POM came to me in the dying days of the Republic with stories about the atrocities committed against the POM, and I believed them. And I think the only time in my life I didn't respond to their appeals, because the Republic was dying. It was the last days, the last hope, and I didn't want to stab it in the back, even if it was true. It was just too terrible. I hate to confess this, but I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry. I feel the real issue is the survival of the Republic.
What was left, after arguments in Barcelona subsided, was a mounting tale of casualties and defeats. Stephen Spender described the suffering of people caught up in a struggle they didn't understand.
The guns spell money's ultimate reason in letters of lead on the spring hillside. But the boy, lying dead under the olive trees, was too young and too silly to have been notable to their important eye. He was a better target for a kiss. When he lived, tall factory hooters never summoned him, nor did restaurant plate glass doors revolve to wave him in. His name never appeared in the papers. The world maintained its traditional wall round the dead with their gold sunk deep as a well, whilst his life, intangible as a stock exchange rumour, drifted outside. Oh, too lightly he threw down his cap one day when the breeze threw petals from the trees. The unflowering walls sprouted with guns, machine gun anger quickly scythed the grasses, flags and leaves fell from hands and branches, the tweed cap rotted in the nettles. Consider his life, which was valueless in terms of employment, hotel ledgers, news files. Consider, 1 bullet in 10,000 kills a man. Ask, was so much expenditure justified on the death of one so young and so silly, lying under the olive trees, O world, O death?
The second year of the war in Spain drew to a close with the country divided in half and Catalonia threatened once again. The Liberal government now had a regular Spanish army. The brigades were now largely Spanish, and the international volunteers had become a political embarrassment to Russia, so they returned home. They had symbolized everything the Popular Front stood for, but with the West pursuing a policy of appeasement with Germany, and Russia preparing to defend itself against fascism by diplomatic means, once again, as at the beginning of the war, the Spanish Republic was left to fight the nationalist advance alone. In the last winter of the war, Louis MacNeice recorded the endurance of the Catalonians as Franco's troops drew nearer to victory.
The road ran downhill into Spain. The wind blew fresh on bamboo grasses. The white plane trees were bone naked, and the issues plain. We have come to a place in space where shortly all of us may be forced to camp in time. The slender searchlights climb. Our sins will find us out, even our sins of omission. When I reached the town, it was dark. No lights in the streets, but 2.5 millions of people in circulation, condemned like the beasts in the ark with nothing but water around them. Will there ever be a green tree or a rock that is dry? The shops are empty, and in Barceloneta the eye sockets of the houses are empty. But still they manage to laugh, though they have no eggs, no milk, no fish, no fruit, no tobacco, no butter, though they live upon lentils and sleep in the metro, though the old order is gone, and the golden calf of Catalan industry shattered, the human values remain, purged in the fire, and it appears that every man's desire is life rather than victuals. Life being more, it seems, than merely the bare permission to keep alive and receive orders. Humanity being more than a mechanism to be oiled and greased and forever unaware of the work it is turning out, of why the wheels keep turning. Here, at least, the soul has found its voice, though not indeed by choice. The cost was heavy.
In one way, I thought that if one was sufficiently involved in the reality of the struggle, then one would, as it were, automatically write about it, because it would provide one's environment and be the centre of all one's feelings and be what one would most care about. But the 1930s, though, was such a sort of desperate period that one realized, though, that if one got to that point, one would probably be destroyed, either by being, one thought, for instance, if you were going to write a poem about the enormity of a concentration camp, you would have to be in a concentration camp. You couldn't sit at home in St. John's Wood writing it. But in fact, you also notice that no one in a concentration camp could write a poem about being in a concentration camp, or practically no one, because the possibility of doing so had been destroyed by the very fact of being there. The same with the Spanish Civil War. If you really wanted to write the poetry of the Spanish Civil War, you had to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Very little literature, in fact, did come out from people fighting in the Spanish Civil War and so on. So that was one aspect of it. The other aspect of it was that one thought one might write, at least I thought I might write, a kind of poetry about the ideas which were involved in the revolution and the vision of a better society and so on. People have always wanted to do this, and it goes back to Shelley, really. And I did try and write a few poems of this sort. I can't think that any of them were thought successful, but I did try.
What remains from that generation of writers is a record of the human spirit that turned an untrained army of peasants and workers into a force able to withstand Franco's legions and Hitler's bombers for nearly 3 years. But by February 1939, Franco's victory was assured. When Franco entered Madrid, George Orwell was back in an England unprepared for the fight against fascism.
Because of the feeling that we ought to be doing something, though actually there was nothing we could do, we left Banyuls earlier than we had intended. With every mile that you went northward, France grew greener and softer. And then England, southern England, probably the sleekest landscape in the world. It is difficult when you pass that way, especially when you are peacefully recovering from seasickness with the plush cushions of a boat train carriage under your bum, to believe that anything is really happening anyway. Earthquakes in Japan, famines in China, revolution in Mexico. Don't worry, the milk will be on the doorstep tomorrow morning. The new statesman will come out on Friday. The industrial towns were far away, a smudge of smoke and misery hidden by the curve of the earth's surface. Down here it was still the England I had known in my childhood. The railway cuttings smothered in wild flowers, the deep meadows where the great shining horses browse and meditate, the slow-moving streams bordered by willows, the green bosom of the elms, the larkspur in the cottage gardens, and then the huge, peaceful wilderness of outer London, the barges on the miry river, the posters telling of cricket matches and royal weddings, the men in bowler hats, the pigeons in Trafalgar Square, the red buses, the blue policemen, all sleeping the deep, deep sleep of England, from which I sometimes fear we shall never wake till we are jerked out of it by the roar of bombs.